And ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, I am honored, absolutely honored to be with you today. Today is actually the first show of 2025. So I'll say to you all, Happy New Year. For those who don't know, and thanks to Roland, it's right there up on the screen, I am Michael Cord Esquire. I'm an attorney, and I host a show every month here at Philly Cam called TV Courtroom. TV Courtroom is an opportunity for me to share with you my insight on the law and to address issues that you find important. It's actually a kind of spin-off from a radio show I've been doing for about 15 years now called Radio Courtroom. And that Radio Courtroom show, what we do is to enlighten folks about the legal system. We also throw in stuff about politics and culture and history and current events. And we've taken that Radio Courtroom format and transformed it into this, which is the TV Courtroom. And in TV Courtroom, we talk about issues affecting the law and other stuff connected to and connected with the law. We got a number of topics I want to share with you. For the first 7 to 10 minutes of the show, I'm going to talk to you about a couple articles I wrote in the Philadelphia Tribune. More about that later. But the highlight of the show will be a guest, Teri Himebaugh. And Teri Himebaugh is an attorney, but to call her an attorney is an understatement. She's a great litigator seeking justice for those most oppressed. That's interesting. I just freestyled that. That wasn't something I wrote down, but knowing what I knew about her, I just said in my head, what's the best way to describe Teri Himebaugh? And as I said, she's an exceptional litigator seeking justice for those who need it most. And she does this in her capacity as the executive director of something called the Police Transparency Project. That's the Police Transparency Project. And we're going to spend 20, 25 minutes or so with attorney Teri Himebaugh about her and about the Police Transparency Project. But for the first several minutes, I want to talk with you about a column I write for the Tribune. Technically, it's two. I write a weekly column called Freedom's Journal. I write a monthly column called Black Dollars Matter. And I want to reference you to two recent articles I wrote, one very recent, so recent it hasn't even happened yet, because I normally write them on Thursday or Friday, and they're published Friday evenings in the Sunday Tribune. But it's online Friday evenings and available in hard copy late Saturday or early Sunday. And the first column I want to share with you is entitled, Will Trump Cause a Second Civil War? Will Trump cause a second civil war? For more information about this, because I can't go into explicit detail during this limited 1-hour show, I encourage people to go to the Philadelphia Tribune's website at phillytrib.com. That's phillytrib.com. Thanks to our producer and engineer extraordinaire, Roland. You see that right up on the screen, phillytrib.com. Once you go to that website, simply type in Cord, C-O-A-R-D, and all of my literally hundreds of articles will come up. Or you can just make it easy. Just Google phillytrib.com. I guess the best way to do it is Philadelphia Tribune, Cord, and whatever topic I'm telling you about. So if I were you, I would type in Google, Philadelphia Tribune, Cord, C-O-A-R-D, and Trump Civil War. You put those words in the search engine and you'll find the article. Remember, the title or headline of the article is Will Trump Cause a Civil War? And let me just read a couple lines from the article and then expound upon them. The article again is entitled, Will Trump Cause a Second Civil War? It starts like this. And I actually wrote this about a week or so ago. And I say here, on January 6th, it will be exactly 4 years to the very day that adjudicated felon Donald Trump, who J.D. Vance, his vice president, once called, quote, America's Hitler. Let me just pause right there. The guy you selected to be your running mate for the election, the guy who was elected, you'll serve beginning January 20th as the new vice president, but that guy called you, quote, America's Hitler, unquote. That's interesting to say the least. But let me continue. So on January 6th will be exactly 4 years to the very day that adjudicated felon Donald Trump, who J.D. Vance once called America's Hitler, ignited and fomented a violently treasonous insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, which, by the way, was actually built by enslaved Black men from 1793 until 1826. Let me repeat that. That prestigious symbol of American freedom called the United States Capitol, which was defiled in a treasonous insurrection on January 6th of 2021, that building was constructed by enslaved Black men from 1793 until 1826. And it wasn't until about 30 years later that those Black men, enslaved Black men, and other enslaved Black people finally, kind of, sort of, got their freedom with the, on December 6, 1865, with the 13th Amendment. But I digress. Let me go back to the point. So the point is to answer the question, will Trump cause a second civil war? And I think the best way to start out is to show you what he's already done. You know, it's funny because when people are running for office and they want me to vote for them, or they want me to endorse them, or they want me to make a campaign contribution, this is what I say to them. Don't tell me what you're going to do. Show me what you've already done. That's how you want to decide who to vote for in any election, a municipal election, a statewide election, or a federal election. You want to present it to the candidate like this. Don't tell me what you're going to do. Show me what you've already done. And once I see what you've already done, I can figure out what you're probably going to do. So when I talk about this issue of a second civil war, all I have to do is to go back to January 6, 2021. And you might think that some of the language I used in that initial paragraph, violently treasonous insurrection. Violently treasonous insurrection. Okay, violent. Okay, that means to use force. Clearly force was used. You saw the video. Treasonous. Treasonous means that you have engaged in treason. What is treason? Treason is defined in the federal code as, quote, giving aid and comfort to the enemy of the country, unquote. To give aid and comfort to the enemy of the country, unquote. That's exactly what was done. Whether you love or hate this country, there's certain rules. There's the Constitution, and there's a requirement that the vote for the president be certified. So if you come along to undermine the Constitution and the role of the federal government, and you do it in a violent way, then that's treason, quote, giving aid and comfort to the enemy. And then the third part, insurrection. What is insurrection? It's an attempt to violently overthrow an established government. That's an insurrection. An attempt to violently overthrow a government. So when I use the phrase violently treasonous insurrection, that's exactly what I'm talking about. So again, first paragraph of this article, Philadelphia Tribune, simply Google Philadelphia Tribune, type in CORD, C-O-A-R-D, and Trump Civil War. Or just go to the website, phillytrib.com, type in CORD, type in Trump Civil War to come up. So we know what he did on January 6th. Many of us don't know that that building, that U.S. Capitol, was actually built by enslaved Black people from 1793 to 1826. The article goes on to read as follows. And the most historically revolting image from that traitorously deadly act in 2021 is Trump supporter and convicted felon Kevin Seafried, that's spelled S-E-E-F-R-I-E-D. Convicted felon Kevin Seafried parading through the Capitol, waving the pro-slavery Confederate flag. Seafried's act was so repulsive that University of Pennsylvania history professor Mary Frances Berry said in a January 9, 2021 New York Times article, quote, to see it flaunted right in front of your face in the United States Capitol, the heart of the government, was simply outrageous. And Professor Berry was absolutely right. Think about it. And that's when we go back to this whole notion of treason, that the Civil War was Exhibit A regarding treason, an attempt to violently overthrow the government, giving aid and comfort to the enemy. That's treason. So anytime you talk about the Confederate flag, the symbol of the Confederacy, the Southern states who tried to violently overthrow the United States of America, that war, that flag, not only is about treason, but it's also about slavery. That's what the Civil War was about. It was about slavery. Don't let anybody fool you into thinking it was about anything else. It was about whether the South could continue to be part of the United States while enslaving Black people. That was the question. The North said no, the South said yeah. They went to war from 1861 to 1865. Fortunately for me and people who look like me, the North won, the South lost. But did it really lose? Because it continues to celebrate its Confederate war heroes. It continues to wave the Confederate flag, and it continues to get presidents like Trump to celebrate what they represent. That man during that January 6th insurrection, that pro-Trump MAGA supporter, was waving a flag of a group of people who tried to violently overthrow the United States government from 1861 to 1865, and then tried to violently overthrow the federal government on January 6, 2021. And to see the Confederate flag being waved so blatantly on that date during that horrific act of insurrection, as Professor Barry of the University of Pennsylvania said, it was simply outrageous. In fact, it was so outrageous, and let me read you what I wrote in the article. And William Blair, Professor Emeritus of History at Penn State University and the former director of the school's George and Ann Richards Civil War Era Center, so he's the director of the Civil War Era Center, so he knows what he's talking about. He stated in that same article, his words, quote, "The Confederate flag made it deeper into Washington on January 6, 2021, than it did during the Civil War." Think about that. You have an enemy army moving in to your territory. And that enemy army, they made some progress between 1861 and 1865, but lost. That enemy army got deeper into the north in Washington, D.C., got deeper into the north during the January 6, 2021 insurrection than it did during the 1861 to 1865 Civil War. Think about that. And I want you to appreciate the point I'm trying to make here. As outrageous as that Civil War was, that Confederate flag wasn't able to get as far north as it attempted to, because the Northern soldiers were able to rebel. The Union Army were able to, I shouldn't say rebel, I mean repel. The Union Army from the North was able to repel and push back the Southern soldiers, the Confederate soldiers. That was during the Civil War. So the Southern soldiers made some headway waving their Confederate flag, but not enough to get into the North. Well, on January 6, 2021, the Confederacy, through its Confederate flag, through its MAGA supporter, convicted felon Kevin C. Freed, in the words of Professor of the University of, I should say, Professor of Penn State University and the former director of the school's Civil War Era Center, this professor stated, in his words, not mine, his words, he said, quote, "The Confederate flag made it deeper into Washington on January 6, 2021 than it did during the Civil War." So when I raised the question in my headline, quote, "Will Trump cause a second Civil War?" unquote, that's not an exaggeration. That's not being irrational. That's not hyperbole. That's a historical fact based on what we know. And then I go on to write the following. Think about that for a minute. The pro-slavery Confederate flag got deeper into the North during Trump's violent insurrection of 2021 than it did during the Confederates' violent insurrection of 1861 to 1865. That's just part of what I want to talk about. Remember, I said I want to talk to you about 3 topics today. One is this: will Trump cause a second civil war? The second one I didn't really get into, but quite interesting, and I'll spend a few minutes at the end of the show talking with you about it. It was, and here's the headline of that other Tribune article, quote, "Did you know that the real Lone Ranger was Black?" Now, if you're probably under the age of 40, you might not know anything about the Lone Ranger, but just Google it. But the question I put in this article is, did you know that the real Lone Ranger was Black? More about that later. But right now, as I said early in the show, of the 3 topics, we're about to go to the star of the show. And the star of the show is attorney Teri B. Himebaugh in connection with the Police Transparency Project. And now we'll begin with an important discussion with attorney Himebaugh about the Police Transparency Project. And I encourage everybody to get their pens out, get their pads out, because the professor will be enlightening us. And that professor is Teri B. Himebaugh, the executive director of the Police Transparency Project. Teri, how are you doing today?
Fine, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for making yourself available, because the good news is that the Police Transparency Project has done a great job. But understand that that great job is soon coming to an end. Not sure about that, but that's why we have you here. For those who don't know, let me just spend a couple seconds talking to you about our guest. Again, it's Teri B. Himebaugh, the executive director of the Police Transparency Project. And normally, before I have a guest on, I'll, read a few blurbs of a few things about them. But Teri is so thorough that her bio is about, maybe 1,313 pages long. It's that impressive. But let me cut to the chase. Teri has a Juris Doctor and a legal master degree. Has been practicing law for more than 32 years, and the current practice is limited to cases involving police misconduct, prisoner civil rights, and state and federal homicide appeals. Everything I wanted to say in reviewing her bio, which was really impressive to me. Very rarely do you meet a practicing attorney who's been designated an expert. And Teri has been qualified as an expert in civil rights legal malpractice, and in the federal rules of civil procedure. That's quite powerful. And also, and I didn't know such a thing existed, an expert on jail suicide. So we're going to have a ball today talking to Teri and listening to Teri. First and foremost, Teri, I kind of mentioned a few things about your background, but when I have impressive guests like you, I'd like you to fill in the blanks before we get into the meetup, because I want people to know that you didn't just Google some stuff last night and come on the show today. This is your life. Tell us about your education and your employment.
Certainly. I got a legal master's degree after my Juris Doctor. The Juris Doctor was at New England School of Law, which was the first law school for women in Boston. After that, I went to Washington College of Law, American University, where I got my legal master's degree in international civil rights law. I worked for a period of time with Amnesty International, which brought me for the first time into the prisons. And I saw what a need there was for civil rights advocacy domestically, not just internationally. So I turned my focus to domestic civil rights. I worked for almost 2 years at the DC Department of Human Rights, litigating claims of discrimination and employment discrimination. And then after that, decided to come to Philadelphia. And I chose Philadelphia primarily because this is where in the late 80s, early 90s, the civil rights problem was really the most acute on the East Coast. We had a history in Philadelphia stemming back from the 80s when the Philadelphia police became the first police force to be federally charged with civil rights violations. And as a result of that, they've been on the radar ever since. While the methods have changed that the police and prosecutors have been using since the 80s, the fact that there's prosecutorial misconduct and police misconduct has not changed. So in the course of my being a civil attorney doing prisoner civil rights and police misconduct cases, I came across a couple of homicide detectives. Initially, James Pitts, who is now a former homicide detective, who is been criminally convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice related to his beating a false confession out of one of my clients, who was subsequently found to be actually innocent. The FBI was able to determine to a nth degree of certainty that he could not have been the one to commit the crime. He served 11 and a half years in state prison because Detective Pitts fabricated testimony, fabricated his confession. And I saw that this was not the first time that Pitts had been doing this. I had been actually tracking Pitts for about 34 years and saw that there were certain patterns that I was seeing in the homicide cases that I was doing. When you do just one homicide a year or two homicides a year, you may not see the patterns. But when you do as many homicide appeals as I do, you start seeing patterns. And that was the first indication to us that this was a systemic problem and not just one or two bad apples. So we started seeing a pattern, which we later identified in the unconstitutional pattern and practice database, which we'll talk about. And the pattern has specific attributes to it, behaviors that homicide detectives were regularly using. They would bring an individual in who they believed to be vulnerable, either someone who is very young, very old, juveniles without their parents, someone who's on drugs, someone who is particularly elderly, who's on medication, who has mental health problems. They hold them for a period of up to 3 days before they actually start the interrogation. It's the warm-up period, so to speak. During that period of time, they use verbal threats. Detective Pitts used physical threats. He was well known. He was a very, very large man, and he was well known for getting into the individual's face, spitting on them, growling at them, and physically manhandling them, grabbing them by the neck, grabbing them by the genitals, forcing their head down to the desk. He did physical things such as that. They would also, one of the patterns would be deny people access to their attorneys, deny them access to the bathroom, deny them access to food during that entire period of time, all done as an effort to wear them down to a place where they would basically agree to sign whatever the detectives put in front of them. Then the detectives would come in, usually, like I say, 2 to 3 days after the person, or a very long period of time after the person had been originally taken into interrogation. And they would come in either with a pre-written statement, or they would come in and say, hey, we know what happened. You just tell us what happened here. You agree to what happened. And if you don't, your mother is going to go to jail. Your daughter is going to go to jail. You're going to lose your children. You're going to lose Section 8 housing. There's a variety of threats that could be used, as well as obviously you could be charged with murder, and everyone you love is going to be charged with you for accessory. Once a person has been so physiologically and psychologically abused for such a period of time, they present them with a statement and say, hey, you can get out of here if you just sign the statement. And at least 80% of the individuals who are presented with the statement don't even read the statement. They sign it because they want to get the heck out of the homicide unit and back to their family. And they don't realize what they've done, because they sign statements that are in fact very important, very often confessions. So,
Terry, before you begin, I just want to interject very quickly. I said at the beginning that you didn't just Google some stuff last night and come on, and we can tell because you're a wealth of information. If there were ever a person who was born for the role of executive director of the Police Transparency Project, it is you. I just want to ask a few follow-up questions because I'm just so thoroughly impressed. When I heard you mention your work with Amnesty International, I'm even more impressed with you. I already like you, and now that I hear your ties to Amnesty International, that made it much better. And I love the fact, Terry, that you explained why you chose Philadelphia. I write for the Philadelphia Tribune, and I remember years ago when I came across what I thought was just plain wrong, which said that Philadelphia, Pennsylvania was the first city in the United States of America to be prosecuted by the Justice Department. I said, you must mean Philadelphia, Mississippi, not Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but it was Philadelphia. So the fact that you were clearly aware of that and came here for that purpose, I'm thoroughly impressed. One of the things I want to ask, because you used the phrase actual innocence, would you just spend a couple minutes explaining that? Because I teach at Temple University as an adjunct professor, and I explain to the students that when you go to trial, it's not a question of guilt or innocence. It's a question of guilt or not guilt. That's why when the judge tells the jury to go back and deliberate, the judge gives them the option guilty or not guilty, not guilty or innocent. A person doesn't have to be found innocent, but you use the phrase actual innocence. What does that mean?
Well, there's really two types of relief an individual can get. If they're actually innocent, it means that you've been able to establish to a reasonable degree of legal certainty that they did not commit the crime. In Obina Anaya's case, the FBI had 3 individual peer reviews that were able to tell from forensic height evidence from videotapes that it could not have been the person who committed the crime. My client was multiple inches taller than the individual who was in the video. So they're able to absolutely determine that he did not commit the crime. Then there are those individuals who are wrongly convicted. Wrongly convicted is a larger group of individuals. They are individuals who they're not being freed on mere technicalities. It's not as if an individual who perhaps they have the wrong address on a search warrant, and as a result the case has to be tossed out. When you're wrongfully convicted, it means that there is some very specific information that has been not provided to you either by the defense, such as alternative suspects, statements made that would have helped the defense by other witnesses, evidence that was not turned over in the way of scientific proof that was not turned over, a bunch of different information that you were not provided. And as a result of the fact that the extent of the abuse by the government in not providing this information, that your conviction cannot be relied upon as being fair. So you're wrongfully convicted. Now,
and let me just interject quickly, and I love the way you're breaking this down, Teri, because it's important that lawyers like you and me, when we talk to the public, we don't talk like nerdy law school professors. We break it down to the audience, and you're doing an excellent job at that. I want to thank you. I'm sure you're like me, Teri. We cringe when we hear somebody say that so-and-so got off on a technicality. I make the argument that there's no such thing as a technicality. What's your position regarding that?
Well, I don't deal in technicalities. These are significant violations of the Constitution. I mean, our government and our legal system depends on everybody playing by the same rules, following the Constitution and the constitutional provisions. But when one group feels that they're not required to follow the Constitution and that they can make up their own rules, we can have no trust or confidence in any of the convictions. And that's the problem, is that when it's not just one bad apple, when you show that this is a systemic problem, as we have shown, we have identified over 200 officers in the Philadelphia Police Department who have significant histories of misconduct in their history, in their background. And when it's not just one or two, and these are talking about individuals, for example, Detective Pitts, who the City of Philadelphia District Attorney's Office stipulated that he had done these things for the majority of his 30-year career in the police department. And this is not like a whodunit. We all know that he has done this. And he touched probably over 100 to 200 homicides per year. And so if you look at over 30 years, his corruption, his misconduct has touched thousands and thousands of criminal convictions, criminal homicide convictions. And if you can't trust in the conviction, how do we know that we're locking up the right people? How do we know that the people who are committing these crimes are not still free? We are also, on the other side of this, it's not just about the families and the defendants themselves who suffer, but the city of Philadelphia is paying out tons, millions of dollars because they have wrongfully convicted all of these individuals. And this is
Again, Terry, I just love the way you're making it clear. And I got to tell you, I didn't know that Pitts had been, what do you say, 30 years in the Philadelphia law enforcement, and that there's at least 200 police officers with a significant history of misconduct. Let's go back quickly to Detective Pitts. Would you take the position as I do that this can't be one bad apple? It's got to be systemic because the other cops had to know what was going on. What's your response?
Well, first of all, Pitts they work as a team. They have a team approach in homicide, where even if Pitts is the lead detective, other detectives help. And so even if Pitts was not the lead detective in a case, he quite often was brought in as the closer. I happen to have access to performance evaluations for Detective Pitts and his partner during the time, which was Detective Omar Jenkins. Detective Omar Jenkins is himself in the hot seat related to two other cases of mine where there's a questions of whether or not he committed perjury in those cases. And certainly he was present when Pitts committed the vast majority of the abuse that is now being brought forward that Pitts has committed over the last 30 years. This is not one bad apple. This is also a lack of supervision. I'm aware of the directives that have been put out in the police department. I actually helped draft some of the directives over the years. And it's not the fact that they don't have the rules. The fact is that the supervisors are not enforcing the rules in that unit. And this is not, there's more than one homicide unit, and we're not having problems with all of the homicide units. We're having problems with one specific unit, which shows that this is indeed a problem with supervision and lack thereof. So we've brought, for example, in Mr. Obina's civil case stemming from his exoneration, we've brought what's known as a Monell claim against the city of Philadelphia, alleging that the city has a pattern and practice of failing to properly supervise these homicide detectives, which allow them and encourage them to commit these crimes over and over and over.
I just love, again, the way that you are enlightening us. If the audience is like me, they have 2.5, 3 pages of notes based on what you're sharing with us, so we appreciate it. Those who just tuned in, we're listening to Teri B. Himebaugh, who holds a JD and a legal master's degree. She's been practicing law for more than 33 years. Her current practice is limited to cases involving police misconduct, prisoner civil rights, and state and federal homicide appeals. She's the executive director of the Police Transparency Project. Teri, what does the project do?
Well, we started out primarily as a database, and we have the only publicly accessible database of police and prosecutorial misconduct that is available in Pennsylvania. We gather the data, we analyze it, looking for unconstitutional patterns of practices of misconduct. We identify necessary training, directives, or legislative initiatives that need to be undertaken. We perform legislative advocacy. We provide continuing legal education to investigators, attorneys in the community. I'm very concerned, as a matter of fact, that there are very, very few attorneys who do what I do. Matter of fact, when I retire, there will be probably maybe 2 or 3 left in the grouping of attorneys in Philadelphia who do this. And we have thousands of these cases, and we're talking thousands, literally thousands, and more to be coming. We have 2 detectives who are currently facing criminal charges in other cases related to perjury and obstruction. If and when they are convicted, which I have every reason to believe they will be, then their cases will need to be reviewed, just like Pitt's cases have had to be reviewed, just like Nordo's cases had to be reviewed. And that is going to take years and years and years of work by the district attorney and many defense attorneys to get through that whole list of people who potentially have been injured.
Teri, let me ask this. I want to play the devil's advocate and say, okay, Teri Himebaugh, great attorney doing great work, but isn't it a waste of time? Because these people she's talking about, they're not choir boys and choir girls, and maybe a cop, you kind of step the line here and there, but at least we're getting rid of the bad guys. What's your response?
Well, first of all, you're not always getting rid of the bad guys. You're actually incarcerating a lot of people who are really very good, who have not committed any crime or who haven't committed this crime at least. And the point is that we're not here for good enough. That's not our system. Our system's not based on, well, it's good enough. It's based on beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you don't have beyond a reasonable doubt, and then you later learn that what you thought was beyond a reasonable doubt is nowhere near beyond reasonable doubt, you have an obligation to overturn that conviction, regardless of whether the person is a choir boy or not. The fact remains that the rule of law is the rule of law. And if we don't believe in it, if we don't uphold it, how can we expect anyone else to uphold it?
I am so happy you broke it down like that. And I often tell people who present me with that question, you know how you feel when a cop pulls you over the highway for 30 minutes. Can you imagine 30 years of that nonstop? So I'm glad you explained it the way that you did. You talked about a few of the detectives who were involved in misconduct, and you said it's not a one bad apple thing. How pervasive is it, would you say? Most, half, some? What would you say?
Well, I'm not going to say most. I can tell you that this one unit within homicide, it is a majority of the homicide detectives within that unit. Within the other departments, robbery, vice, the other departments of Philadelphia, we frankly have not gotten deep enough. We do know that there is a very significant problem within the narcotics units. That's been evident for quite a few years. Basically, one of the reasons we need more funding, and we need funding, is not just so that we can keep doing the work that we're doing in homicide, but so that we can also expand to include narcotics, vice, and some of the other units. And we've also been asked by other counties, Montgomery County, Dauphin County, Lucerne County, Erie County, if we could do something similar in their counties to provide their citizens with the same sort of information that we're providing in Philadelphia. But frankly, our hands are tied by lack of donations and lack of funding. It's very hard to get people behind giving donations to an organization such as ours because of the perception that we are trying to just open the floodgates. And that's not what we're doing. What we're trying to do is to ensure justice and fairness for everyone. And transparency is the only way to do that. We have to know that the officers that are enforcing the laws are not breaking the laws.
We are listening to and looking at Professor, I'm calling her Professor Teri B. Himebaugh, who holds a Juris Doctor and a legal master's degree. She's been practicing law for more than 33 years. Her current practice is limited to cases involving police misconduct, prisoner civil rights, and state and federal homicide appeals. Teri, you talked about whether or not there is pervasive misconduct among detectives and police. What about prosecutorial misconduct? First of all, what is prosecutorial misconduct, and is that pervasive?
Well, first of all, all the information that the police have is legally imputed to the prosecutor. So whether the prosecutor actually knows or not, the prosecutor has a responsibility to find out. Okay, that's a first. So if the prosecutor looks at something and they say, oh, I see this note in the file that there was a tip that there was an alternative suspect, that prosecutor has a responsibility to follow up with the police and say, did you follow up? And did you check that alternative suspect out? A lot of prosecutors turn a blind eye. They basically take the detectives at whatever the detective's word is, and they don't bother checking. They also, unfortunately, prosecutorial misconduct, the primary problem is with Brady violations. We're talking about Brady versus Maryland, which is a Supreme Court case that requires the prosecutors turn over to the defense any information that might be helpful to the defense. Now, there's no bright line of this is Brady, that's not Brady, and it's left up to the prosecutor's discretion. That's where the problem comes in. Depending on the view that prosecutor has, depends on what discretion they will utilize and whether they will turn that information over. For example, we're finding that there's something that we call Brady-Giglio disclosures. That's disclosures of information about detectives or police officers committing misconduct. That's the sort of information that prosecutors are required under Brady versus Maryland to disclose to the defense. Up until Larry Krasner becoming DA, we were not receiving Brady-Giglio disclosures on any of the police officers handling cases. you weren't receiving anything. So there was no way for a defense attorney to know, oh, this police officer has been found 3 times by Internal Affairs to have provided false testimony in Internal Affairs investigations. Well, that might be quite significant if you're relying on that officer to tell the truth at the trial. You might want to use that in order to impeach his credibility at the trial. And we weren't getting that information. It's only since Larry Krasner became a DA and he instituted his open file policy that that's been made available to us. We've also, for the first time, had access to the homicide detective's file and the prosecutor's file. And I've gone down to their office and looked through these files, boxes of files, and I've found things in prosecutors' files that have floored me. I found a list, I found a note written on a cocktail napkin that was between one DA and another DA. And the note simply said, threaten, and then put the name of the Commonwealth witness that they needed to change the story. And it was, I don't know why someone would keep a cocktail napkin with that sort of information on it, but that is blown apart the case because now we have evidence that this individual had to be threatened in order to give over the information that he gave.
Teri, that sounds like something out of a movie, not something that lawyers experience in real life. Teri, we were supposed to end this at 4:05. It's now 4:11. Would you mind if we steal 10 more minutes of your time? Because we're thoroughly impressed. So you talked about the issue of detective/police misconduct and prosecutor misconduct. What role, if any, does Internal Affairs play? Are they helpful? Are they effective? Are they a waste of time? What would you say?
Well, the only way that we get Brady Giglio disclosures is from 2 sources. One of the sources are sustained Internal Affairs findings, and the other source are criminal cases where there has been relief granted by the criminal courts or the civil courts. Internal Affairs is supposed to be the primary basis for which a citizen can make a complaint. That complaint is investigated, and if in fact there's been misconduct, you're supposed to be able to rely on the fact that Internal Affairs will not only discipline or recommend discipline for that individual, but that individual will then not repeat that and be allowed to testify or do other things that might be consistent with his misconduct. Internal Affairs, however, in reality has been hobbled entirely by the Fraternal Order of Police. I have, for example, in Detective Pitt's cases, there have been Internal Affairs investigations where there have been sustained findings, meaning they've gone all the way through the process, several levels of review within Internal Affairs. They've had what's known as a PBI hearing, where there's an actual hearing where they're represented by counsel and the evidence is looked at. And then it goes to the commissioner, and the commissioner has found sustained findings of misconduct, only to have those findings and those punishments overturned by the Fraternal Order of Police. Crazily, it floors me that in Obina Anaya's case, where Mr. Anaya was exonerated by the FBI experts, that Detective Pitt won his arbitration. And if he had not been convicted criminally, he would have been entitled to his job back with reinstatement of back pay.
Oh, and that's a fact. This is no hyperbole. That would have happened.
Yes.
This is frightening. We have about maybe 6 more minutes left. And again, those just tuned in, we have a great guest, so great that we stole an extra 10 minutes of her time because her information is quite enlightening. It's Teri B. Himebaugh, who holds a JD and a legal master's degree from practicing for more than 33 years, practiced limited to cases involving police misconduct, prison civil rights, and state and federal homicide appeals, and she's been qualified in several fields. So it's a blessing for us to have her. We're going to continue this for another 5 or 6 minutes, but if people want more information about the Police Transparency Project, is there a website? Is there a social media post? How can people get more information?
Well, we do have a website, and we are on Facebook and Instagram, and we actually would love for you to get on and follow us. The website is www.thepolicetransparencyproject.com. You can access that website, and from that website, you can access our database where you can search by detective's name, you can search by pattern or practice, and it gives you not just information, but actually has hyperlinks to the actual documents so that you can download them directly from there and you can use them in your criminal case. We also have a link to continuing legal education. We have a 5-part video series that we put on last year. It's accredited through Paxil that you can download. We also are going to be offering another CLE accredited on February 22nd, and that continuing legal education class is open to everyone, including private investigators, lawyers, and community members. The morning session, we're going to be talking about how to investigate claims of new evidence, specifically Brady-type claims. And in the afternoon, we're going to be talking about how to prepare for and conduct PCRA hearings, and we're hoping to have one of the prominent PCRA judges join us.
Excellent, absolutely excellent. In our final 3-4 minutes, Teri, show is called TV Courtroom, and in many TV and many courtroom proceedings, obviously at the end of the trial, there's an opportunity for a closing argument. Well, we're going to give you the opportunity now for a 3, 4, 5-minute closing argument. Anything you want to repeat, anything you want to expand upon, anything you want to add, the final 3, 4, 5 minutes are yours.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I would just want your viewers to know that relying on the Constitution is fundamental to our democracy. If we have seen nothing else but in the past couple years that ignoring the Constitution causes chaos, we must understand that we have to abide by the rules. Because if we don't abide by the rules, it's going to be very hard for us to get anyone else to abide by them. This is such a significant problem in Philadelphia that it's going to cost taxpayers millions of dollars, has already cost taxpayers millions of dollars, and will continue to do so. Just since 2023, we have already had over, I believe, 15 exonerations. And that's just since 2023. It's not even looking at since 2017 when we really started to gear up for this sort of claim. I would imagine that in the next 10 to 15 years, we're still going to be dealing with the concept of police misconduct or prisoner misconduct. This is not at all different than what we dealt with in the late 80s and early 90s when the federal government found that the Philadelphia police committed federal violations of the Civil Rights Act. Back then, a detective would dress up in a white rabbit costume, including the full headpiece, and he would go into an interrogation room where an individual was handcuffed to a chair, and he'd beat the suspect with a phone book until the suspect agreed to sign whatever they wanted him to sign. Well, these detectives may not be dressing up in white rabbit suits, but what they're doing is exactly the same thing. They may not be beating him with phone books, but they are doing the exact same thing as they were doing in the 80s and the 90s. They are using it as a means to an end rather than upholding the law, which is what we have to do. If we want the law to be respected, we have to be the ones to uphold it first if we anticipate anyone else doing it.
I have to tell you, I thought I knew all that needed to be known about the Police Transparency Project, but I knew very, very little. This is a tremendous resource, and you are prominent in providing that resource to the public. I'm going to reach out to you off the air, Teri, to see if, just like you were a guest here on the TV Courtroom, if you can also be a guest on my radio courtroom show, because your information is important. And I love the way you present it. You make it digestible to the audience that does not consist of lawyers, people, everyday folks who need to know this information. So I really want to thank you. Again, folks, we've had on the show today a prominent guest, a prominent attorney, Teri Himebaugh, who holds a JD and a legal master's degree, been practicing law for more than 33 years, current practice limited to cases involving police misconduct, prisoner civil rights, and state and federal homicide appeals, and has been qualified as an expert in a number of fields. We stole an additional 13, 14 minutes of your time, but from my standpoint, it was much needed and very much appreciated. Teri, thank you very much for spending time with us, but more important, thank you for the great work you do.
Well, thank you for having me. It is my pleasure. I'll be happy to speak to your radio show anytime.
Sounds great. Thank you very much. Folks, that was a great interview. And I just mentioned the radio show called Radio Courtroom. You can find more information about that by tuning into that show. Every Saturday from 1 to 3 p.m., Radio Courtroom. That's WURD 96.1 FM, WURD 96.1 FM, or just go to WURDradio.com. That's WURDradio.com. Folks, we had such a great time with Teri Himebaugh, and I meant what I said. I'm going to have her as a guest on my radio show so that she can provide even more information. The good news is that she was a great guest. The bad news is that she was such a great guest that we won't have enough time to get to and finish the other two topics. We have about 4 or 5 minutes left, so let me try to squeeze everything in by imploring upon you the need for you to check out an article I wrote in the Philadelphia Tribune entitled, "Will Trump Cause a Second Civil War?" Just go to phillytrib.com, type in CORD, COARD, type in Trump Second Civil War, it'll come up, or just Google Philadelphia Tribune, Michael Cord, Trump Second Civil War. And let me just try to close out on that particular topic and spend a minute at the very end on the other topic. I point out that in response to the question of whether or not he'll cause a second civil war, I pointed out what he did by fomenting a violent insurrection on January 6, 2021. I explained how one of the worst parts of that was he had one of his MAGA supporters waving a Confederate flag at the U.S. Capitol. And you know what the Confederate flag stands for? It stands for slavery. So that was a message to us. And I got to the issue of Trump being a racist. And I pointed out that he's the same guy who in 2017 described the Nazis as, quote, very fine people. He's the same guy who, as a candidate in 2016, in 2020, and in 2024, was endorsed by the KKK. Let me stop right there for a second. A candidate for the presidency of the United States of America was endorsed by the KKK. What does that tell you? It tells you everything you need to know. But let me add more about this racism. Way back in 1989, he put out a full-page ad calling for the death penalty of the so-called Central Park Five. 5 Black and brown boys who we found out were not only not guilty of the assault, but factually innocent. And years later, in 2016, when the state of New York said, oh man, our bad, we shouldn't have found these kids guilty, the state of New York in 2016 apologized and gave these kids money. Well, they were adults by that time. And Trump said in 2016, the state of New York should not have apologized and should not have given them any money. In 1975, Trump was fined by the U.S. Department of Justice for housing discrimination, where he would not allow Black people to become tenants in his property. Getting back to the whole Civil War thing and the pro-slavery thing and whether or not he's a racist, follow me on this. Let me read this direct quote. In 2018, just 2 years after Trump first took office, and about 2 years before his January 6, 2021 insurrection, USA Today published an article citing a Rasmussen Reports poll, which noted that, follow me on this, which noted that 31% of US voters say it's likely that the United States will experience a second civil war. Think about that. So I'm alerting people. I hope that I'm alarming people to be so concerned that they do something about it. And what should they do about it? Pay attention. To be forewarned is to be forearmed. If you're like me, you were devastated shortly after November 5, following the election and the results that came about. but simply because we were knocked down doesn't mean we should stay down. Great fighters like Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier and Joe Louis, they've been knocked down many times, but each time they got up and fought the good fight. I'm encouraging Black people. I'm encouraging women. I'm encouraging gay people. I'm encouraging transgender people. I'm encouraging brown people, red people, yellow people, disabled people. I'm encouraging everybody who is alienated by the American system not to feel so beaten down for the next 4 years to do nothing, but to be emboldened and get up off the mat. And I'm basically preaching to the choir myself. After the November 5 election, I basically stayed in bed for 2 or 3 days with a blanket over my head, whimpering. But I realized that I have in my genetic makeup my ancestors who went through slavery. And I know they were looking down at me saying, Michael, what the hell is wrong with you? You were involved in a situation where a racist, pro-Civil War, pro-Confederate guy won, and now you're going to stay in bed for 2 or 3 days with blankets over your head. We, from 1619, that's my enslaved ancestors now, we from 1619 to passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, that's 246 years. We went through the hell of slavery and we overcame it. You got a negative result in an election and now you're whimpering like a little baby. Get out of bed, get off the mat, stand up and fight. And that's what I'm encouraging people to do. Stand up and fight to make sure that there is no second Civil War, that America turn out to be what it is supposed to be. In my final 60 seconds, anybody who's at least 40 years old, and obviously folks who have parents who are 50, 60, 70, or grandparent, you know about the Lone Ranger. He was the guy who had the white uniform on and he rode the white horse and he had a quote unquote Indian sidekick. And I hate that name Indian because they weren't Indians. They were the indigenous people from this land. Anyway, this whole Lone Ranger thing was like a superhero. He started out on the radio back in the 40s and 50s where people sit around the radio and listen to stories about the Lone Ranger. And then beginning in 1933, there was actually there was a radio show from 33 to 1954. That was first. And then after that radio show called The Lone Ranger, then later, and from 1949 to 1957, there was a TV show. And it was a white guy with the white uniform on and the white horse, and he had his so-called Indian sidekick, and America loved him. But many people would be shocked to know that the real Lone Ranger was a Black man by the name of Bass, B-A-S-S, Reeves, R-E-E-V-E-S. And in this Sunday's edition of the Philadelphia Tribune, in an article entitled, "Did You Know That the Real Lone Ranger Was Black?" I break it down and explain all you need to know. What you need to know now is the show has to wrap up. Big shout out to our guest, Teri Himebaugh, who provided some powerful, enlightening information about the Police Transparency Project. That's the first thing I want to say. And the final thing I want to say is what I say at the end of every show. Think Black. I'm out.